So, what was Orientalism, or what is rather Orientalism? There are many ways to approach it, and you can look at the author's own definition of Orientalism and how he approached it. But it's essentially a paradigm, a corrective paradigm. It's a paradigm that helps us to understand not only how the West gets the rest of the world wrong, but how the East or the non Western world gets itself wrong. This is for me the most important contribution of Edward Said's Orientalism work. Now, so what is it all about? Now, drawing on very important contributions by thinkers like Michel Foucault, what Edward Said did was to see how power and knowledge mutually interact. In many ways, actually mutually pollute each other. So it's a kind of a negative dialectic, if you can put it that way. So knowledge is power, but power also shapes knowledge and vice versa. This was essentially the crux of Michel Foucault's contribution to social sciences and understanding of operations of power and discourse in the modern era. You can see that in his book, History of Sexuality, Discipline and Punish, among others, or Archaeology of Science or Knowledge. So there are many works of Michel Foucault that we can discuss separately. So Edward Said very intelligently and very deftly drew on Foucault's analysis of the interaction between knowledge and power to understand how prejudice, stereotype, and imperial calculations very much also poisoned or at least undermined an honest assessment of the non-Western world. Now, because Edward Said had Arab, Palestinian background, and he did a lot of his basic education in Egypt, but at the same time, because this was a person who was educated in very posh Victorian style kind of institutions, and later on also in two Ivy League universities of Princeton and Harvard. So he was someone who was in a perfect place to understand both East and the West, but more particularly the Anglo-American world on one hand, and to a lesser degree, the Francophone world, and the other hand, the Arab world, right? This was really what he was focused on. Now, Edward Said, of course, was able to pull off what he did because of his encyclopedic knowledge about not only the world per se, but also the understanding and the knowledge industry about the world, right? But he was primarily focused in his work, Orientalism, on how the Arabs and the Islamic world in general is portrayed in Western scholarship. And by extension, in his later books, he also looked at how Western media and mainstream media in the Western world has approached its news about the Islamic world or the Middle East essentially through an Orientalist prism, largely thanks to the pundits or Orientalist experts, among others, that Western media tends to rely on, and all the kind of secondhand derivative Orientalists, simplifications and stereotypes out there. Now, the first argument that Edward Said was making is knowledge is not produced in a vacuum, especially the knowledge that is gathered under imperial calculus. So if you look at a lot of early social sciences, anthropology, archaeology, among others, they develop under the auspices of European imperialism in places like Egypt, in across the Middle East, which happens to be also the cradle of civilizations. So imperial calculus always influence how early social science developed, and this would be carried over throughout the centuries, precisely because the West is still the dominant geopolitical power on Earth. That's kind of changing with China, but we can talk about how China is doing its own version of Occidentalism or semi-Orientalism towards other Eastern societies. We can talk about that separately, which I think is a very interesting topic. But going back to this, so Edward Said looked at first how knowledge was never produced in a vacuum. There was always a power dynamic there. To get the funding, to get the support, not to get censored. All of those consideration had to, be part of the design of the projects that scholars had during the early days of social sciences, when they were doing archaeology, when they were doing linguistic studies, among others, in the Orient. But the second thing is very important, is that you have to also understand the formative years and upbringing of a lot of these scholars from Europe, and later on from America, and the rest of the Anglo-American world, who went to the Middle East, among others, and how much of their knowledge about this part of the world was informed by their own you know uh, theological biblical studies, right? Not necessarily based on historiography coming out of different traditions of scholarship across the world. And then, of course, you also have to understand, and this is the third and important element, you also have to understand that when a lot of early social sciences emerge, this was also the era when the West began to become more and more contemptuous of the colonists, right? Or people that were about to colonize. So that's very interesting. In fact, if you look at books by Frankopan Silk Roads, for instance. He looks at how in the 16th and 17th century, when the Europeans came in contact with the Ottomans or Osmania, or they came in contact with the East, the Far East, or or for instance with the Safavids, there was a lot of respect. There was a kind of a gravitas to this Oriental empires, or the Mughal court, for instance, the kind of reverence that Europeans held them, in the early modern era. But later on, as these empires fell apart and as colonization entered a new phase of aggressive acquisition and aggressive humiliation of these former empires in the non European world, what you see is also this parallel development, this psychological cultural development of contempt, right? Self-serving contempt, because it's easier for you to justify morally to yourself that, oh, these people have to be colonized because we have to civilize them, mission civilisatrice, and the white man's burden and all of that, blah blah blah, right? All of that self-serving imperial narratives, so that they can get rid of the moral burden of the horrible things that was happening in the colonies. The Bengal famine, for instance, which claims millions of lives. The reaction in China, where you had the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, and tens of millions of people died as China tried to respond to colonization. The horrible humiliation that was visited upon the Safavids and the Qajars in Persia, or the slow motion disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. I can go on and on and on. Not to mention the horrible, horrible things that the Portuguese and other Europeans did, for instance, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially. Um, you know, Howard French is a fantastic book on this. I really suggest you check that book, because it looks at how you can look at the roots of modern Western imperialism and modernity, for that matter. You can trace the roots of that to the campaigns, the mini imperial campaigns and slave catching campaigns of the Portuguese conquistadors, right? And that brings us, of course, to the other major victim of European Western imperialism, which is Latin America, right? I mean, millions of people in the old civilizations died in Mexico. Is today's Mexico. We were talking about the Aztecs, for instance. Things didn't also look too good for the Incas, right, when they were taken over by the conquistadors. So horrible things. So you just read Guns, Germs, and Steel, among other books. Also, The Dawn of Everything. It looks at how European imperialism was extremely devastating to what we today call Latin America or South America. Um, Now, going back to this, so Edward Said was, I think, also made a very important contribution in the sense that, you know, if your knowledge of the East, and in this case, the Arab and Muslim world, is informed by imperial competition, is informed by prejudice, is informed by all of those distortionary elements, and then, and this is where I think he was a true scholar, and then you had some people who had the audacity to make universal, you know, time space proof generalization about the Arab or Muslim world and the people in the Orient, then ipso facto, you're going to run into trouble. Ipso facto, you're going to have a more prejudiced, stereotype based kind of analysis rather than a true scholarship, right? Because anyone who is familiar actually with the ebbs and flows of time is familiar with history. Again, going back to Dawn of Everything, among other fantastic grand historical works. If you look at these works, or Sapiens, for instance, by Yuval Noah Harari, or look at books by, for instance, Francis Fukuyama, Origins of Political Order. If you look at these grand historical books, they all tell you one fundamental truth, which is, you know, there's nothing static about human civilizations, no matter which regions of the world they come from. I mean, just look at the Vikings. 1,000 years ago, they were among the most scary and quote unquote savage people, and now you go to Scandinavia, go to Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, and these are the most peaceable and peaceful and prosperous parts of Earth, and likely for the foreseeable future, right? The most progressive parts of the world, right? Um, the Middle East was the cradle of sciences from the ninth century, beginning with the translation movement, all the way to at least 11th to 12th century, right? The Ottoman Empire was the epitome of imperial prowess well into the 17th and arguably even the 18th century. Russia was nothing but a backward feudalistic society in the 15th 16th century, and then Peter the Great comes, and later on Catherine the Great comes and completely transforms the trajectory of Russia, and then Russia goes downwards later on, and then it comes back stronger under the Soviet Empire. I mean, just look at Putin, for instance. Under Putin's rule, in the first 10 years, Russia comes back. It's a story of resurgence. The next 10 years is a story of decline. So there's nothing really static about societies all around the world. I can go on and on and on about China, for instance. China alone is an amazing story of ups and downs. China 50, 60 years ago was one of the poorest countries on earth. Now it's a new global empire, not too different, or in a way, it has even surpassed its imperial glory back in the ancient era. Or look at Japan, for instance, before the establishment of a kind of a unified shogunate. You had their own version of warring states, just like China, except thousands of years later. So Japan was a backward feudalistic society, in fact, arguably up until the late 19th century. And it took a huge civil war and a major restoration for Japan to place itself on the track towards, you know, not only restoration but modernization. And by early 20th century, Japan was already knocking at the door of the West. Look at Korea, for instance, South Korea, for instance, extremely poor country. By 50s and 60s, it was poorer than the Philippines, for instance. And yet today, it's one of the most dynamic countries. So I can go on and on and on and on and on about how countless civilizations and societies had their ebbs and flows. So the problem with a lot of scholarship, according to Edward Said, about the Orient is that there is this kind of an eternal essence superimposed on the Eastern people. Oh, the Chinese are this. They have been like that 2,000 years ago. They'll be like that for the next 2,000 years. Oh, Muslims are this. Even though Muslims are extremely diverse people, Egyptians are extremely different from Turks, and Turks are extremely different from Persians, and Persians are extremely different from Tajiks, even though both are Persian-speaking countries. And the Tajiks are extremely different from Malaysians and Indonesians, and so on and so forth, right? So this is the problem, and this is a problem. And in fact, the great manifestation of that kind of Orientalist thinking was not only in the works of Bernard Lewis, but the other person who was also influenced by Bernard Lewis, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. It's all about essences of different civilizations, extreme simplification of extremely diverse systems of governance, of rules, of culture, and a whole bunch of people, billions of people in some cases, close to 2 billion Muslim, for instance, who come from completely different societies and histories and backgrounds and all of that. And Clash of Civilization of Samuel Huntington did not even take into consideration, for instance, rivalry within civilizations, right? And he also had this very arbitrary demarcations whereby Japan was supposed to be a different civilization altogether from much of Northeast Asia, when in fact we know, anyone who has a basic knowledge of the East knows that from Vietnam to Korea to Japan, all of these are scenic cultures. Yeah, they were influenced by Chinese culture. In fact, there was a time where Korea, maybe up till now, that Korea claims that they're the true heirs of the Ming Dynasty, because when the Manchus took over and created the Qing Dynasty, China for hundreds of years was under a non-very Chinese kind of rule. So if you look at, for instance, some of I remember a few years ago when I was in Seoul, I was watching this play about this ancient, love story, tragic love story, their own version of Romeo and Juliet in Korea, and they dress like Ming court people, right? I mean, you could see the clear influence of the Ming Dynasty, for instance, on Korea, right? Um, so this is the brilliance of Edward Said's work, because he shows that fundamentally there's something wrong with a lot of scholarship about this, because there's this presupposition that the West is rational and dynamic and evolving. I mean, what was Europe 500, 600 years ago? Even 300 years ago, much of Europe was, right? But the assumption is, if you're European and Western, Occidental, whatever, you're dynamic, you're agents of history. But the East, it's like observing, species out there who have certain eternal essences, which is completely inimical not only to historical evidence, archaeological evidence, to common sense even, but also to biology, evolutionary biology. All human beings are a product of evolutionary biology. So if you understand basic evolutionary biology, for instance, you'll understand that all human beings had to evolve in a certain degree for survival, but also for prosperity and for thriving and in service of a greater ideal. So, but this brings me really to the next part, the next big implication of Edward Said's Orientalism. For me, as someone who comes from the non-Western world but is very familiar with the Western world, with the Western literature, etc., perhaps not as much as Edward Said. I mean, I won't dare to even compare myself. But as someone who has at least bothered to read literature from different parts of the world, from Russia, from Middle East, from East Asia, from Latin America, of course, Gabriel Marquez, Leo Simon, and then from Africa, from Europe, so on and so forth. I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I really drew from Edward Said is this, and Southeast Asia, of course. Edward Said is this very unfortunate dynamic whereby like us in East Asia understand those in West Asia through the prism of CNN, or I don't know, Western media or Western scholars, and vice versa. You go to the Middle East, for instance, their understanding of China is not through direct interaction with Chinese scholars. It's through how the West looks at China, and then so on and so forth. And in fact, the other thing that you keep in mind, I mean, interestingly, the book When China Rules the World. If you look at the book, but it's also interesting because there's a part about Japan and how Japan is different from China, and one of the controversial, but some would say maybe irrelevant argument, at least at a certain point in history, was that how Japan at some point wanted to see itself as part of the West, and that created the kind of you know psychological dislocation that may explain the rise of fascism in Japan in the earlier 20th century. Actually, there are a lot of historical documents who also look at, for instance, or great books that look at how, uh, you know, uh, I think Jurgen's, for instance, book on the rise of oil industry and the origins of First World War, among others. It also looks at how how Japan not feeling being welcomed by the West after joining the Allies in the First World War, that also contributed to an anti-democratic, anti-modernity turn in China and the embrace of fascism, right? So, and we see a lot of permutation of that across history and across continents, across places. I mean, it's very interesting. In fact, even if you look at the works of Habermas and so-called Westbindung project and all, many sociologists would argue that even Germany was not considered as Western until the post-war Japan completely embraced a more kind of a liberal, democratic, uh, essentially project, right? So this is what's interesting. This is what's interesting. In fact, people like Pankaj Mishra would argue that when we say West, it's not really Europe per se. It's not like Belgium or Luxembourg or even Sweden. We're really talking about the Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon world, right? Even the French see themselves quite differently from the Anglo-American world. But in the case of Edward Said, he kind of put them together. The French imperial project, Mission Civilisatrice, and the whole white man's burden of America and the British versions of that earlier. Um, Now, again, going back to this is what's really sad for me. When you read Orientalism, you realize that there's this kind of a mental enslavement whereby even scholars from the non-Western world understand other scholars. Let's say scholars from Southeast Asia, or Western educated scholars from Asia, understanding scholars from other parts of Asia through the literature, through the institutions that are based in the West, which in one or another may have been influenced by Orientalism. A lot of discourse, of course, about China, about Russia, about this rising authoritarian powers. Again, you see a lot of a huge tinge of Orientalism there, right? Um, Instead of appreciation of how dictatorial regime make it very difficult for Chinese or Russians of different persuasions to challenge the system, right? Or you ignore the fact that the rise of authoritarianism in Russia or China had a lot to do with the failure of Western-backed authoritarian kind of or problematic kind of agents like Yeltsin in the case of Russia.